Good morning, and thank you for joining us. The Chamber has been a leader on environmental, social, and governance issues for over a decade. During that time, the Chamber has met with countless businesses, investors, academics, and policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic. As you'll hear today, the Chamber is committed to a pragmatic approach to ESG policies. We represent stakeholders across the spectrum, many of whom are seeking more information about climate change, an issue of importance to all. But ESG is larger than climate change, and some of the current discussions in Congress, in the regulatory agencies in the EU and elsewhere will have significant consequences in markets throughout the world. Today's event is the first in a series that we will have on ESG. It is a privilege to continue our ongoing dialogue on these issues, and we have a great lineup of speakers today, including our CEO and President, Suzanne Clark. Suzanne, let me turn the virtual floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Tom. As you just mentioned, we've been working on ESG issues for a long time, and over the coming months, we're going to explore various parts of ESG disclosure, which is really, as you know, a complex issue that's on the minds of policymakers, regulators, business leaders, corporate directors, and investors, maybe more than ever. And we're looking forward to sharing the progress the business community is already making on these issues. We want to dispel common misconceptions and really work together to develop solutions that are driven by business innovation and enabled by practical public policies. So today, we're going to focus on one aspect of ESG, which is climate change, and we're delighted to be joined by influential pro-business voices like the Miami Mayor Francis Suarez, as well as Congressman Carlos Curbelo and Congressman French Hill. We'll also, of course, be joined by other public and private sector leaders. So before we get into ESG implications for climate, let me touch just really briefly on the challenge of climate change itself. At the U.S. Chamber, we've long collaborated with our members and other stakeholders on this issue, and we believe there is common ground to address climate change with policies that are practical, flexible, predictable, and durable. Enabling innovation and empowering businesses to lead is central to that effort because businesses are developing, financing, building, and operating the solutions that will address this challenge. Thanks to the private sector, the U.S. is now among the world's leaders in reducing emissions. However, the reality is that neither business nor government can solve climate change alone. The private sector is committed to doing even more to drive meaningful solutions, and we need public policies that will support these efforts and not thwart them. One way the public sector advances climate efforts is through ESG disclosures. The Chamber has been involved in the global and domestic discussions on ESG for the past decade. We believe the best way to achieve the lofty goals businesses have set for themselves is through principles-based and proactive reporting on this issue. We've had extensive meetings with the SEC and provided recommendations to the agency on how to strengthen, not stifle, the business community as we shape the future of ESG. And as the SEC begins to explore these issues, we believe it's important for them to review the development of market-based ESG efforts that are rooted in the long relied upon materiality standard and that are workable for companies of different sizes and different industries. So let me just briefly unpack that. First, materiality. The Supreme Court rulings on disclosing material information as incorporated into current SEC regulations is the right approach to ESG reporting, as opposed to arbitrary mandates and expansive regulations. For more than 80 years, the materiality standard has ensured public company disclosure is relevant to the operations of the organization rather than broad mandates or sprawling disclosures dictated by activists or adversaries. It's important to provide investors with the information they need to make investment and governance decisions. Non-material information is equivalent really to no information at all if it doesn't provide insight and allow for real analysis. Justice Thurgood Marshall's writing in this area is as important today as it was almost 50 years ago. Second, businesses should be allowed the flexibility of a principles-based approach rather than prescriptive one-size-fits-all mandates. No two organizations, investors, or circumstances are the same. What's relevant for one company might not be relevant for another, and the concerns and goals of investors certainly change over time. For example, we've seen increased interest in sustainability in recent years, and public companies have proactively adapted their disclosure accordingly. Today, more than 90% of companies in the S&P 500 voluntarily publish annual sustainability reports. That's up from just 20% in 2011. That happened organically, and it happened proactively. Businesses, more so than regulators, understand the rapidly evolving appetite their investors, employees, and consumers have for information, and they've been responsive. As we consider the future of ESG mandates, it's more than just the short-term success of individual companies that are at stake. The guidelines we set will help determine the competitiveness of America's capital markets themselves. The U.S. has set the gold standard for disclosure, and ESG must fit within that model. We've seen a 50% drop in public companies since 1996, and our markets are facing unprecedented international competition. Overly prescriptive mandates and expansive regulations would impose significant costs with unclear benefits and could make it even less attractive for private companies to go public. This, of course, hurts Main Street investors and retirees who rely on the market to build wealth. As we debate the future of ESG more broadly and climate change specifically, we must keep in mind how onerous and ever-changing regulations have a track record of slowing progress. Businesses need durable, long-term policy that doesn't risk changing at the hands of unelected officials every time the White House switches parties. We all share the same goals, a cleaner, more sustainable, safer future, but debates differ over how to get there. Some are driven by an assumption that government and government alone can solve big problems. This is a pessimistic belief. It's based on a false notion, the false notion that companies are driven solely by self-interest or even greed. And those who hold this view think businesses have to be forcibly compelled by an all-knowing bureaucracy to act in the interest of anyone or anything else. At the U.S. Chamber, we know that's not true, and we have a much more optimistic vision. We believe in the power of free enterprise, the power of human ingenuity, and the power of American business innovation to champion solutions that are practical and sustainable. Over the course of the past year and a half, we've all been reminded of the ways business solves big challenges and moves society forward. It was the private sector, not the government, that kept our communities operating, kept families connected and safe, and ultimately created vaccines that will bring the end of the pandemic. And Americans noticed. That's in part why the 2021 Edelman Trust Barometer found that business is the most trusted institution in society, outperforming government across every issue measured. On climate change, like so many other challenges, policymakers are important partners in our efforts. But companies are not sitting back and waiting for Washington to act. The American business community is driven by a can-do approach for getting things done and a must-do commitment to customers, employees, and communities. As policymakers embark on important discussions around ESG efforts, they must do so with a clear understanding as to the leadership businesses can and will continue to demonstrate to move these issues forward. Thank you.
Suzanne, thank you for your remarks and for reminding us of the great strides the business community has made on ESG topics, including climate and the possibilities that lie before us. I'd like to now introduce Congressman French Hill from Arkansas. Congressman Hill is no stranger to the chamber, and he was a senior Treasury Department official under President George H.W. Bush. He was the founder and CEO of Delta Trust and Banking Corp., and was recently named as the ranking member of the Community Development and Insurance Subcommittee. Congressman Hill, welcome back. Pleasure to see you.
Tom, it's great to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
And before we start to talk about ESG, which is the topic of our event here, can you tell us a little bit about your appointment as ranking member and what your plans are on the subcommittee?
Well, I'm glad to be ranking member on the Community Development, Housing, and Insurance Subcommittee. This is an issue that I've had a lot of passion about, both from my private sector work as a investment banker and a community banker over many years, but I started my career on the Senate Banking Committee staff as the top staffer for John Tower when he chaired the Senate Subcommittee on Housing and Urban Affairs. So I look forward to these issues. Chair Maxine Waters' focus is more subsidies and larger budgets for HUD. She's proposing Section 8 as an entitlement program. That's one that I think that Republicans aren't in favor of. But we had a hearing last week on the Community Development Block Grant Program, the CDBG program, that was initiated back in 1974 when the Nixon administration, the Ford administration, rolled up all of the community development type programs from the 60s into a block grant. It was reformed by President Reagan in his first term, and not much has happened since. In fact, we haven't had a hearing in House Financial Services on the Community Development Block Grant Program since 2006. So these formulas and this process is overdue. We may look for some bipartisan work in that arena. And finally, in the insurance, we are still at loggerheads over reauthorizing the National Flood Program, which once again expires its authorization in September. And Patrick McHenry, the senior Republican on the committee, Maxine Waters, our chair, in the last Congress had a collaborative bipartisan proposal that got out of the committee unanimously, but did not make it to the House floor. And this Congress, unfortunately, Chair Waters has not decided to work on this project in a bipartisan way. So it's a mixed bag, Tom, but we look forward to carrying the issues forward and doing a good job on behalf of the taxpayers to have a solid set of community development priorities in the Congress.
Well, you're going to have your hands full. I don't think there's ever a Congress where we're not talking about flood and or TRIA. So good luck with that. But let's shift our focus to ESG. And last week, Congress passed a pretty sprawling, very expansive ESG bill by one vote, 215 to 214. And before I get to an amendment that you offered during that debate last week, passing a very expansive bill by one vote generally means that there's not a consensus of approach. Can you talk a little bit about, that there's, at least in the House, we've got a lot of different views on these issues?
Well, we do. There's not a bipartisan consensus on this. This was a bill driven by Maxine Waters to have a very message-driven, far left progressive approach to ESG reporting by public companies. And you can tell that by a one vote difference. Even Speaker Pelosi had to be called out of her office to come to the floor and vote in order to even have that one vote margin. Several Democrats voted no, and a number of Democrats didn't show up for the vote. So there's not a consensus even on the Democratic side of the aisle about this far left, big government approach to ESG mandates that Maxine Waters brought to the floor last week.
Now, as I mentioned, you offered an amendment during the debate, and your amendment would have struck the bill and replaced it with a requirement for the SEC to perform a study summarizing and describing any differences in methodologies related to ESG and climate risk disclosures, which could be before the committee, before they impose anything on public companies.
Right.
Could you tell us about what your approach was with that amendment?
Sure. Well, look, as our chair said a few minutes ago, public companies are not ignoring climate disclosure. This is a myth. The vast majority of large publicly traded companies are dealing with climate by reporting material risks on their financial statements, and they have extensive sustainability disclosure metrics disclosed and initiatives described on their websites almost uniformly in an environmental section on their website. They are getting the information that investors are requesting. The challenge is, how do you do that on a comparable way? How do you do it in a financially measurable way that can be incorporated in the financial statements under GAAP that are material disclosures? And there's a lot of debate about that. Mandating one approach is not ready for prime time. And let me give you a couple of examples. First, Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, who's devoted his retirement days to financial disclosure on climate, now as the special envoy for the United Nations, he appointed a task force on climate disclosure led by Michael Bloomberg that reported in 2017 all the challenges associated with financial disclosure. In fact, debating what was the right course. They laid out a framework of things for our items and types of measurement for public companies to consider, particularly those who are in high risk arena as it relates to carbon emissions. So the idea of the study, Tom, was to look at all the different metrics used to measure various aspects of carbon emission and sequestration of carbon, offsets to carbon, and give public company guidance for reporting officers, chief financial officers, how you might do this. And final comment, even the Bloomberg task force, which was totally stacked with people who were already pro-mandated financial disclosure, said it's hard to do because people don't understand the time frame. They don't understand how to convert the metrics into a financially disclosable issue. They're not sure how to determine materiality. And so in my view, this needs to be studied in each industry segment in order to create the relevant, comparable, material, technically accurate financial disclosures that can be proposed, whether one is in the power generation business, the trucking transportation industry, the food industry, et cetera. I think there's a diversity of approach and flexibility that has to be there. And individual industry groups are working mightily to come up with the metrics that would be appropriate for their industry.
So you also sent a letter recently to the SEC that was signed by 22 of your colleagues on the Financial Services Committee, where you've expressed some concerns about the potential of going down the path of a one-size-fits-all disclosure. And you talked a lot about some of the flexibility that, in the letter that you were just also talking about. Raising those concerns to the SEC in that letter, you also mentioned that you think the SEC is departing from its core mission if it proceeds with a one-size-fits-all rule. Can you explain the letter, what some of the points were in that, and what you meant about that last part about departing from its mission?
Well, the SEC is not a climate regulator. It's not an environmental or science regulator. It facilitates information being prepared in a common, relevant, comparable way on a material basis for the investors to use in order to make investment decisions. And they do that on a level playing field type manner. And at the heart of it is the fact that our boards of directors and our executive management make determinations within those financial rules, within the disclosure framework, about what's material and what should be disclosed and how to provide that communication to their investors. That's at the heart of our security systems for 8 decades. And that's at the heart of the responsibility of the duty of care and fiduciary duty that officers and directors have now to listen to their investors. Finally, look, the system is not broken. Investors who want a particular form of climate metric disclosed are petitioning on a regular basis through the proxy process. And I would argue chief financial officers and boards are looking at that, listening to it. Institutional investors in the same way. But when you look at the existing disclosure using climate metrics as discussed in the Bloomberg task force, you see 5, 6, 7, 8 different approaches that none of which have a majority. And that was an error, I think, in the approach that the SEC intimated it was taking and that Maxine Waters proposed last week, which is we're going to pick one and we're going to make everybody in every industry follow that approach. And we're going to expand the definition of what we consider is material as it relates to climate. And I don't think that's the approach the commission should take. And I don't think that's the legacy of the commission's style of operating to make sure investors and issuers have accurate financial statements.
So you mentioned the proxy, right? And we're sort of at the tail end of the proxy season where most of the shareholder meetings have occurred. But we've seen a lot of shareholder proposals around ESG. A lot of them are in the social category. And Obviously, we're talking about climate change.
Right.
But this activity also has impacts on governance and on the businesses themselves. How do you see that level of activity impacting public companies? And I want to also add just a quick follow-on to that as well, where I read about 6 weeks ago, there was an op-ed in the Financial Times by someone from State Street. They said, well, if we're going to do ESG disclosures for public companies, let's do it for private companies too. And do you see an appetite to also expand SEC oversight and disclosures onto private companies?
Well, it's certainly discussed in the Mike Bloomberg task force for the G20 on financial disclosure, where they intimate it should be mandated for public and private companies. And as you know, the European Union has already mandated for large investment managers that they already are forced to disclose climate metrics in the investments they make in Europe. And that, I assume, could be a public or a private investment. So I think there is an appetite among the progressive left to mandate private company disclosures in this arena. I don't think, as I've said, that's the right way to go, and I think it's a detriment to the style of American corporate governance that's given us the most competitive capital markets in the world, which is to put that burden on boards and management about what is material to them and how best to describe it in their industry. And Tom, look, in the power industry, in the electric utility industry, they've got a pretty straightforward business metric. They're using GHG, greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, as a way to measure their carbon footprint and their long-term evolution away from, say, coal-based emissions to then merging to natural gas, using more nuclear, adding some solar where appropriate as battery storage improves. That's the way they've chosen to do that. GHG. However, if you look at, again, the Bloomberg report, they urge moving away from GHG. And yet I would say that's one of the most frequently used measurement devices, even though scope 1 and scope 2 are relatively straightforward for a business to consider calculating. Scope 3 is very complicated, very expensive. And the SEC has an obligation when it thinks about disclosure regimes to have a cost-benefit analysis. Part of their statutory obligation to think through this very carefully. And that's another reason why I objected to the approach taken by Chair Waters last week, is it throws cost benefit to the side for all these ESG reporting obligations. And finally, Tom, as it relates to the letter to Chair Gensler, there's an intimation they're setting up an enforcement task force at the SEC. Well, if we're not agreed upon what we're measuring and how we're measuring it by industry, how in the world can we set up, quote unquote, an enforcement task force? And that leads concern to many people, many issuers, that the SEC is going to make rules by enforcement, something that all of us who believe in our economic freedom in this country urge our independent regulatory agencies use the Administrative Procedures Act. We don't create rules by enforcement in our government.
So let me ask you one last question, and thank you for being so generous with your time. I think you raised a very important point, right? Because when you talk about scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, you're talking about historic data, right? Activity that has occurred, which is traditionally what disclosures are about. But when you start to talk about scope 3, it's about future-looking disclosures, right? And, putting on your private sector hat, because you've not only been a legislator and a policymaker, but you've run a financial firm and you've had to deal with the SEC and other things. If we get this wrong, what do you think the impacts on our capital markets are going to be?
Right. Well, it's true. Since the 1980s, I've been a director of private companies and public companies. I'm a certified public company director by UCLA's Anderson School. I've spent a lot of time thinking about corporate governance and hopefully advocating for outstanding corporate governance practices in the companies that I've been affiliated with over those many decades. And I even led a study at the Treasury for Nick Brady, Treasury Secretary at the time, on best practices in corporate governance to make America make sure America's businesses were thinking long run about our competitive position. So I'm concerned about the approach that's being taken, that it could be a chilling effect on our capital markets, that we don't maintain Americans' competitiveness. And we also presume that there is all the costs are worth it from the standpoint of microscopically disclosing any forward projection climate risk. I think it chills companies going public. I think it raises the costs, deterring mid-cap companies from thinking about going public. I think it increases litigation risk to be a public company as people parse, well, you disclosed this scope 3 thing, but we disagree with it. We're suing you as a shareholder with 100 shares or 1,000 shares because we don't think you accurately disclosed in your financial statement your scope 3 risk based on our point of view. And that's why I side, I believe, with our friend Warren Buffett, CEO at Berkshire Hathaway, who in May's annual meeting said the extremists on the subject of climate on both sides are nuts. And I think that's right. We've got to recognize that we're moving towards a less carbon intensive future, but we need an all of the above energy strategy to produce the base load energy to run and have a competitive society and a consumer household that has affordable access to products, services, and energy that they need. And so it's a balancing act. And in my view, the approach taken by House Democrats last week is not part of that balancing act. And that's why I'm so outspoken against the approach that they proposed.
Well, Congressman Hill, I want to thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your insights. As always, we welcome your leadership. As I said, we are starting a dialogue on ESG, so we look forward to having you back and continuing the discussion.
Thanks, Tom. Great to be with you.
Great. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to invite Congressman Carlos Curbelo and Miami Mayor Francis Suarez to continue the conversation.
Hello, I'm Carlos Curbelo. I'm joined by Miami Mayor Francis Suarez today, and we both want to thank Suzanne Clark and everyone at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for inviting us to be a small part of this very important gathering to discuss ESG policies. Thank you to the Chamber, and Mayor, thank you for making the time for this important conversation.
Thank you, Congressman. It's an honor and a privilege to be with you, as well as all the Chamber members.
So we have to start at a very obvious place. Miami, some will say, is having a moment. I understand, Mayor, that you like to call it a movement, but without a doubt, Miami's making big headlines, attracting a lot of people, and not just people, but also capital. How have you made this happen? You've been the face of this movement. You have been on TV, you have been on Twitter, restlessly recruiting people and capital to Miami. How has it happened? Why is Miami living through this special moment?
Well, I think as any business person knows, you have to take advantage of opportunities. And when you see that are failing to take care of their residents, failing to allow the residents to feel appreciated, it created a great dynamic for the city of Miami, where we realized that if we could just focus on 3 areas, keeping taxes as low as humanly possible, focus on keeping our city safe by increasing funding to our police departments, and focus on creating the best quality of life, the best amenities that any city has to offer, then we would have a winning formula that would attract people to cities, while other cities, unfortunately, are doing the opposite of what we're doing. So, this sort of happened quickly with a very simple tweet where someone put out there, hey, what if we bring Silicon Valley to Miami? And I simply tweeted back, how can I help? And that, some people call it the tweet heard around the world, but it was a tweet that went viral simply because we were counter to the narrative that people who are prosperous, companies that are doing well, are not, they're not contributing to problems, they're solving problems in our community. And I think, a lot of cities, unfortunately, across America, don't understand that simple fact.
Now, Mayor, clearly you're pro-business, you're a capitalist, you support free markets, you're a Republican, but you're no stranger to the issue of climate change. As a matter of fact, for years, you have been talking about this issue, leading on it. Why did you decide that this was an important issue for you to adopt, to advocate for, to lead on? We understand that you're in a leadership position now in the U.S. Conference of Mayors, where you're also dedicating a lot of time to this issue. That might confuse some people. On the one hand, you're talking about growing businesses, attracting capital in Miami, but you're also talking about climate change and how we can address it. Talk to us about that balance.
Well, I simply don't buy into the notion that they are mutually exclusive. I don't think that it's the economy versus the environment. I think the environment is the economy. And in Florida and in Miami in particular, that reality is extremely stark. We know that we need clean drinking water to survive. We know that our bay, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry, has to be clean so that people can enjoy water and recreational sports. So for us, the economy and the ecology, our ecology, are tied very much together. And so I think, unfortunately, it's an issue that has become polarizing and has become partisan. And frankly, I think for us, we have to push beyond that and look at this as an issue, where there is not an antagonism, where having promulgating policies that help the environment are good for our economy. And I think that's what we've been focusing on here in Miami. And I think that will change the national conversation on this issue. And frankly, I think there's another, dynamic that needs to be discussed, which is the environment as a national security issue that could threaten sort of peace and stability in the world. And I think that's another way of discussing this issue that takes it out of a more partisan envelope and puts it into sort of the more mainstream conversation.
So can you talk to us a little more about some of the unique challenges that Miami faces? Certainly flooding comes to mind. Are some of these investors, some of these business leaders who are coming to Miami, who are looking to Miami, do they ask you questions about these issues? And what are your answers? What is Miami doing to address some of the challenges that it faces when we think 10, 20, 30 years down the line?
Well, we know that just like with businesses, we know that cities are in a competitive environment, and we know that cities try to counter brand other cities. And so certainly one of the more prevalent counter brands of Miami is don't go to Miami because it's going to be underwater, and pick your year, 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, depending on who's counter branding us. And so what we've done is we've decided to hit that counter brand head on. And we've done that with a series of programs, one of which is called Miami Forever, which is a $200 million resiliency program that is meant to make Miami the most water resilient city on the planet. We're already, post-Hurricane Andrew, the most wind resilient city on the planet. And we have to deal with three basic climatic phenomena. One of them is hurricanes, of which many people don't know that Miami has actually suffered less hurricane damage in the last 10 years in New York City. The other one is dry day flooding, because we have a porous subsoil of limestone that actually 2 times of the year, because of the lunar tides, water will actually come up from underneath the subsoil and will pool in certain areas. And then the third thing is more intense than usual rainfall, which we call rain bombs. And we have just updated our stormwater master plan to take into account these phenomenon, and our $200 million plan, which will hopefully be leveraged with state funding. And the state has already been very proactive. A Republican led governor and legislature has been very proactive on pro-environmental initiatives. And then hopefully the federal government will also get involved so that we can leverage our $200 million into $400 or $600 or $800 million to create the most water resilient city on the planet.
So Mayor, this program today that the Chamber is hosting, the focus is ESG, and the federal government is now in the process of perhaps the SEC strengthening ESG disclosure rules. You've become a national leader, not just because Miami is this wonderful, attractive place these days, but also because you've had a strong and consistent voice on climate change and on other issues related to ESG. What are your feelings on the importance of companies disclosing information on their ESG policies, being transparent with their shareholders, with investors? This is an issue that's going to be dominating the discussion at the federal level for the next year or two. You have any thoughts that you want to share on that?
it's critically important for governments and companies to be transparent about how climate is impacting their bottom line or their residents' quality of life or their ability to have a quality of life. And so for us, we welcome that sort of transparency because we feel like, frankly, we're one of the only cities in the country and maybe one of the only cities in the world that is actually doing something about it, that is actually spending hundreds of millions of dollars, that our residents have agreed to tax themselves. Something that's very unusual, by the way, in Miami. We don't like taxes in Miami, so it's very unusual to have a voter-approved bond, but it's important. And it's important, and by the way, we're under my leadership, we have the second highest bond rating that we've had. The highest bond rating, which is the second highest bond rating available. We have the highest bond rating we've ever had in the history of Miami. And it's because we're very transparent about what are the threats, what are we doing about it, and what does the future look like. But I think for cities as well as companies, I think it's important to hold the elected officials of their localities responsible as well and accountable. Because again, and I think it's also important to speak clearly on this issue and to tell your story and your narrative, because you don't want to be defined by your competitors. No one in business wants to be defined by their competitors. And certainly cities shouldn't allow themselves to be defined by their competitors. You should speak loudly and clearly about what is being done in your city to make sure that you are dealing with climatic phenomenon. And there are climatic issues in every city, in every urban city in America. They're just different ones. And so I think it's important to have the discussion, to take affirmative action on those discussions, and then to disclose them.
Mayor, to close, do you have any advice for corporate leaders, for other mayors, for federal policymakers on finding this healthy balance that you seem to have struck between being open to business, embracing capitalism, embracing free markets, and also being honest and sincere about the risks and challenges that businesses, sectors, communities face? I mean, you talk about how City of Miami residents tax themselves. That's kind of an admission that there's a cost associated with climate change and that cities like Miami are already incurring those costs. So just some final thoughts on how to find this balance, how to both embrace capitalism and also just acknowledge risks and threats that businesses and public leaders like you need to confront every day.
Sure. Every investment that we have to make is a cost, right? Every investment in our infrastructure has a cost. The question is a few things. One is you have to weigh the cost with the cost of doing nothing, right? So, in the case of the city and in the case of my work on the Global Center on Adaptation, which is a global organization that I sit on, all the studies have shown that for every dollar that cities spend prophylactically, they save $7 to $9 post-disaster. So spending money upfront in your infrastructure saves you money in the long run. And I think that's a lesson for companies, which is take a long view, right? Think strategically. Understand that, by the way, that for my generation and the generation that comes after me, this is a very, very important issue, which is why I think from a partisan perspective, it's important that no party dominate this issue and that this issue become as bipartisan as possible, because I really think it's not only an important issue, but it's one that becomes increasingly important to people that are in generations before me, or after me. So I think it's important that companies recognize that this is going to be a factor in how they're judged, and that people will make consumer decisions on the basis of how responsible companies act.
Miami Mayor Francis Suarez, mayor of the hottest city in the United States right now, and not just because it's summer. Thanks so much for joining us. And again, we both want to thank the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for this program and for allowing us to be a part of it.
Thank you so much.
I want to give a big thanks to all of our participants for sharing their insights and perspectives on ESG and climate. As Mayor Suarez so aptly pointed out, climate-related challenges and opportunities must position businesses at the center of the conversation. Solutions demand partnership between government and companies. We will work towards bringing the voices in the ESG conversation closer together to generate the best solutions and to find policies that are thoughtful, workable, flexible, and tailored. We look forward to our next event in this series in late July to further create productive engagements between business and government. Thank you, and all have a nice day.